Hi everybody, Will Bastas here. I want to continue with blacksmith school, and what I'm doing is showing you the fundamentals. This is slow at first. When I would teach this multi-tool, it would take weeks, and it was a very dry exercise, but I really feel like it's important to see these different shapes and to be able to forge these different shapes right off the bat. So I want to talk about it in clay. The forge is cleared up now, and I've got it going again. Turn my ventilator fan off, and that has a tendency to swirl the air in the shop. But the piece that we worked on last time was this, and I wanted to kind of highlight the work that I did with this Scotch-Brite, just to kind of like take a look at the different facets. So this is something that you go through every single time you forge. You are changing the stock from square to octagonal to round, or from round to square to octagonal back to round, or to hexagonal or 16 sides. So you can see what I'm really concerned is that you develop good skills on setting clean transitions here into the oval, here into the square. So things aren't like gradual, they happen abruptly. Here into the almond. The almond terminates here into the octagon. You can see the facets that I'm looking for. And remember, the facets are forged wider on the corner, the edges that you're working. In a later hammer polish, once you hammer polish, these facets get wider, so when you rotate it, you'll see that the facets are the same size. Now, in order to get 16 sides, you have to balance it on that facet right there and count to 4. So what I did is I balanced it on the facet that's opposite of that, and I hammered it there. I balanced on that facet, that's 2, hammered it there. Balanced on that facet, hammered at 3, balanced on that facet, hammered at 4. But keep in mind though that the anvil is only doing 40% of the work, so the facet's going to be larger with the hammer side, so it is tricky to get the 16 sides. Then what I did is I showed you how to forge an octagon, or I'm sorry, a hexagon. This hexagon is a little squashed, but a little bit of practice doesn't take long to just make sure that that is a full-on hexagon. But what I'm looking for is the sides. I've got 3 sides that are visual on this side, and then 3 sides that are visual on this side. Every facet is the same side. And once you see those facets are the same size, then you've got that shape, whether it's a square, octagon, hexagon, 16 sides, and that kind of thing. This was forged by forging it back into the oval. Then when you take your oval, you rotate it 60 degrees, you hammer a facet here, you rotate it back to your initial plane, and the adjacent plane, and you hammer it there. So you'll see as that goes through. So say for instance we take this clay and we do the same thing with it. So we started off with round stock. Now my forge is going really nice, it's running real clean, and I'm going to go ahead and shut it off. I've got a good bed of coal. The first shape that we made from the round, and we'll go from square octagonal round as well, but this it's a good size to start off with for beginners. It's not too big that they have a lot of mass to move. It's not too small where they can't see these shapes. So the first thing we did is we went into the oval, not about 1 to 2, not much further than that. We want to keep the stock contained. That, in other words, 1 to 2, 1 to 3. You go to 1 to 4, it's out of containment, and it's difficult to rotate that through the diagonal axis and keep it from I-beam shape or folding over onto itself. So the first shape we did was this oval shape. Then pay attention to my transitions. I walked the hammer to the edge of the anvil and made it a forged square the whole way. Just as a review, this bar is always, you're holding it level. You're also working perpendicular to the bar. Now I skipped the hammer on the diamond. I forged the octagon, and you can walk the hammer to the edge of the anvil. The hammer will walk around, the anvil never misses. So when I'm hitting here, the force travels through here in a little bit of a diagonal, so I don't have to match it perfectly. If I get pretty close, then the anvil will clean up my stock. So keep that in mind. I'm hitting it here, and then when I get to about here, even though I'm hitting here, the pressure is pushing it all the way to the edge of the anvil, and it's cleaning up to the edge of the anvil. Okay, this is my octagon. Now my octagon, I'm forging just like every other shape. I'm forging it wider here than I am here, because then I'll go back to hammer polish. Hammer polishing does the two things. It polishes the surface because your hammer is polished, your anvil is polished, but also crisps up your edges and gets rid of the texture that you get from the forging process. So there was my octagon, and all the facets are the same. On the 16 sides, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now remember too, it's like I roll it towards myself, but you also may want to roll it away from yourself to counteract the twisting effect that happens to a bar. So if I keep rolling it, and I do a lot of that, I'll get a twist right here, especially if that's a very narrow stem. Now that last shape, the hexagon, came off of the 16 sides. So here's the hexagon. You forge it into the oval, then you rotate this 60 degrees, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but that's about 85, and that's about 45. It needs to be about 60. And then I'm going to hammer this. So now I've got my initial oval rotated at approximately 60 degrees. There's my approximate facet. Now I'm going to rotate it back to my initial hammer blow, which was my oval. Now look at where that pooch is. So I'm going to center the pooch, and then that will tell me the angle that I need. So that's overrolled it, that's underrolled it. So I can see right there, that's my pooch. So that is a hexagon because I started off my initial, I rolled it this way for the first hexagon shape, roll it this way for the second one, and then that will set up your hexagon. And it's hard to see in clay, but I've got 6-sided here, and we're going to cover power hammer work next week. And when you see that, when you work with the power hammer, these things are going to go pretty quickly. But hand forging, it's a little slower, and actually this clay is moving around quite a bit, and it's got an internal rupture, and this is something that actually happens in steel a lot. If you forge too cold, the center of the stock will start to break apart, and then hammering and hammering, eventually that break will rupture towards the center. So that's really what a problem I was having, is that it's not supporting itself. It just was not, but this is like a preview of what happens under the power hammer anyway, and hand forging too when you forge it way too cold. So we'll talk about that later. But anyway, that's the sequence that I was talking about. Now what I want to do is I want to forge this end of it, and this end is a very Hoffy-esque end, and it's a beautiful shape. It's shepherd's crook, but it's really pushing every part of that shape. So it goes with a really nice flare here on the end of the bar, and it tapers from about half of the dimension to nothing. And so what I want to do is I want to show you how I calculate this using the circumference of a circle and the neutral axis and that kind of thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bar that I forged last time, and I'm going to nick it here. Remember, you can nick it and find the angle before you hit it. That way you'll see. So I'm going to cut that bar off at that dimension. Again, center of the fire, level with the fire, control your coking with your mop, dribble it around the fire. You can also darken your fire with your mop. I've got a number of different ways that I can do that with the Arkansas sprinkler. With a bigger Arkansas sprinkler, I won't need that much water right now. As well as with a ladle. I mean, I can kind of dial in how much water I'm putting in certain places with the ladle. So all of these tools are real handy. Rotate it in the fire so you can see it. Now, since that has consumed that bag, it has going hollow. So I'm going to feed the fire from the side. The fire fed from the side will push towards the middle. So it pushes it down around the sides and it pushes it over the middle, and that's what creates your cave. Now I'll bring this coat up from last time. And remember too that you can use a leftover coat that you can put those on top of the fire. If you happen to have large pieces of coke, it's good to save, so you can make a little cave. You can also use these pieces of coke and you can build up that cave as well. So now we've got a good deep fire, and I always like this slurry, whether it's fines or whether it's chunks of coal, because it's pre-wet and that's going to coat and insulate the fire. And I say things over and over again. It's not because I'm losing it. It's because I feel it's important to have repetition and learning. But at the same time, I'm not going to bore you. I'll mention these things less and less, and then they will become cognitive, which is like a deep-seated understanding. They'll become intuitive, where you don't even think about it anymore. But at first, I think you have to be reminded of what these steps are. So let's see if I got my heat in the right place. I nicked that bar somewhere, and sometimes it's easier to see something like that if you rub your hammer on top of it. And when I rub it, I can feel it, but also the scale will fall into it. So there's my nick right there. And remember last time, as far as how we cut this stock, tap everything. I'm going to cut this so that it has a square end. So first I'm going to do is I'm going to notch it in the round. Now if I want a square end on my side, what I have to do is I have to tilt it up. And while I'm going to go one full revolution, I'm going to go back in the fire. I forgot to turn my fire off. Got a nice fire. Turn the fire off before you put your stock in, otherwise you're going to get, I got a really nice fire. Take a look at that. That's a cave. And that cave is getting heat from the bottom, and the heat is reflected back from the top. So it does not take long in a cave to bring it back up to heat. Again, drop your bar to your side when you're walking through your forge, unless you're the only one in there, but it's not a bad practice. The angle of the hammer blow is the same angle that you're holding the stock, and it comes straight down. And just like a pipe cutter, you're cutting lighter and lighter. Take a look at it, because you don't want to risk that, okay? And I didn't do that on purpose, but I acted like I did. So there's my cut. It's very clean, and you can either shear that, or you can just tap it back in. So there's my cut, and that's as if you cut that with a bandsaw, you cut it with a chop saw, but you don't even have to have any, you won't have any burr. And it does upset it a little bit. I don't know if you can see that, but that's a little thinner and that's a little thicker. Versus if you didn't cut it with the pipe cutting style, it would actually thin it, because you're hitting it so hard that it's drawing it out. So this technique will not just give you a clean cut, but also it's like it'll actually thicken the end a little bit. Now what I'd like to do here is skip a width of a hammer blow and do 3 inches of stock that is isolated from the rest of it. And I want to show you how to do that. You may have a tape measure that broke, probably did, and one of the satisfying things about having a broken tape measure is you can use this as a consumable, sacrificial tape measure. And it's helpful though to bend that right on the mark and then break that off. This is a Stanley. It's a very good quality tape measure while that's heating. And I like 2-foot lengths because they are convenient. Not a lot of hand forging is going to be longer than 2 foot. All right, so that's a very accurate tape measure. I can use that for dimensions. Now I've got a 3-footer that I'll save for times that I need extra length. So now I can use this against the edge of the anvil, and I can measure things without fear of burning my tape. It's a very expensive thing to use a really good tape measure hot, because you're going to burn your tape. And I recommend the Stanley 25 footer, and because it's a 1-inch blade, it's got nice carbon steel, and it will extend like 8 foot before it droops and falls down. So one thing I learned in one of my building instruction technology class, let's see if I can find a tape. So this is my 25 footer. You can also measure things vertically. For instance, if I wanted to measure what that dimension was, then what I would do is I would push this against here, and then get myself a foot mark, and that is 1, 2, 3 foot 4 inches. So you can measure overhead knowing that. But if you don't have a good tape measure, it's just it's a practice frustration and futility. There we go. So people complain about this tab. The tab is engineered to have that slop. And I worked for the blacksmith, and he said always burn an inch. So we always measured from the inch, and then 1 foot would be 13 inches. But then you wind up forgetting sometimes, and you're measuring way out here, and you forgot you burned an inch, and you wind up with an error. So the best thing to do on a tape is to just make sure that it has a consistent dimension. So if you pull that on that, that's going to be exactly 24. If you let the tape clutch back in like this with your finger, then it won't bend that tab as it slams back in. It's another one of my pet peeves is when people just let that retract on its own. And what that does is that bends that tab, and it also breaks that off here. So you see that a lot. And that's why you wind up getting broken tape measures. I don't get broken tape measures because I take care of them. They're a sensitive instrument. But if you're concerned about that tab being bent, just confirm that you've got your 24-inch length with something that's fixed, like a framing square. Now, since this framing square is out, I thought it'd be fun to take a look at how to choose a quality anvil and see if the anvil has proper heat treat. So I've got a framing square at 24 inches. And what you can do is you can get a ball bearing. And I got some rust on this ball bearing, and that's any size ball bearing. I have no idea where I got this ball bearing, even if it is a ball bearing. I'll find out here in a minute. If it's a ball bearing, it'll rebound. If it's not a ball bearing, it'll just ding and thud and fall flat. So I'll take a little bit of the rust off. Let's see if it's a ball bearing. So the middle of the anvil, typically in the heat treatment process, is the softest part of the anvil. The hardest part of the anvil are the edges and the ends. Those things get hard because they don't have much mass to lose as far as heat. So if you want to test an anvil, make sure that you've got good hardness, particularly in the middle. Take your ball bearing and put it up at 24. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it drop, and I'm going to see how much rebound I get. And if you get 90% rebound or so, you've got a good anvil. 90% of 24 inches is about 20 inches. So if I get 20 inches on this, the harder that face is, the more rebound you're going to get. But be careful, because a hard face, the anvil, is also have a tendency to chip on the edges. So harder is not always better, but there's a hierarchy of hardness that I follow. The hierarchy of hardness, again, is the anvil is the king. That's the hardest tool in your shop. The hammer is less hard than the anvil. So if you accidentally hit your anvil, then you should ding your hammer instead of dinging your anvil. But it's up to you. All right, so I'm gonna use this ball bearing to see what my rebound looks like. And I got to 20, and that's about 90%. Let's do that again. I got 21.5 that time. So the rebound on this anvil is very good. Let's check the rebound on the anvil that I made. I wonder if it's gonna have good rebound. So starting here at the top. Well, that must be an odd bounce. Let's see. Let's see that happen again. Okay. So I'm not going to get much action on this anvil. And where do you feel that? Well, you know, you can make an anvil out of a chunk of iron, and it's, as long as it supports the hammer blow, it's not going to give you more energy. What happens is if I accidentally tap this with a hammer, that's where I'm really going to see that this anvil is softer than my hammer. So knowing that, if you work with a chunk of iron, a chunk of forklift fork, if you make a Franken anvil, we talked about this last time, or if you just work with a chunk of iron. And I think that one of these demos I'm going to forge with a chunk of iron, and I'm not trying to be a snob by using good anvils. I happen to have good anvils, but I worked with this anvil for a couple years, and I learned on it, and it got me further along. And I've seen exquisite work on a chunk of iron a little bit bigger than that. So if you look at Brian Brazil's work, his work is exceptionally clean, and he has such a flair and a virtuosity, and he works on a chunk of iron. So don't get caught up on bigger anvil, nicer anvil, double bick, all these. It's a privilege, and it's handy, but it's not absolutely essential. I could do the same work, but I always blame the anvil. It's like, it wasn't me, it was the anvil. I needed a better anvil. But ultimately, I think that you can do exquisite work with the fewest amount of tools, so don't get caught up in that. Okay, so what I want to do next is I'm going with the hand crank. What I want to do next is I'm going to isolate, and I'm going to isolate about an inch away from the edge. The blade on this is an inch, and I'm gonna work 3 inches. So, and this is enough heat to mark it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna quench the end. I don't typically wear gloves. I kid around and I grow my own, but it's not a bad idea to wear a glove on the holding hand. But if you wear a glove on the holding hand, it's difficult to quench your stock. I don't mind my hand being wet, but if I've got a wet glove, then that's a different situation altogether. So what I'm gonna do is, an inch away from this, and I'll use this just as a blunt force measuring tool, and I'll do this on the diamond just to be like tricky. So I'm going to reference that point right there, and I'm going to walk this over. Okay, so there's my inch or so. There's my inch, top and bottom. And now I'm going to mark the other side. Now notice when I'm working at the heel, I'm working perpendicular, and the heel it's a tapered face. So I have to work perpendicular. So this appears to be working at an angle, but actually I'm working perpendicular to the edge of the anvil. So now I'm going to go 3 inches from there. So I'm going to have to rotate this way. So this is an advantage using a double bick, because I want this shoulder to be off. I'm using that as my reference plane, and I'm going to walk this over to here. Okay, so there's my 3 inches. There's my 3 inches. And I want to isolate 1 inch away. Now, why do I torture myself to do this? Well, because there's going to be some situations where you have to forge in the middle of the bar. You want to keep in mind to keep whatever you want to maintain that shape off of the anvil. So that's where I'm working this way on the inside shoulder, and I'm working this way on the outside shoulder, and I have to figure out where I get the most support. I can get a lot of support here, but I'm not going to get very much like rebound from the anvil. So I'm going to work as far as I can here, and even if I have to work around the holes, it's not a problem. So this is a tricky exercise, but it's intended to be that way, so we can have a square in the middle of a round bar. So here we go. I'm going to pack my fire as it starts getting a little bit hollow. I've got a lot of coke. I'm using my shovel to pack. Got a nice little cave. No gloves, because I do have a tendency to want to quench the bar. I could use tongs as well. I've got my heat, so I'm going to quench the bar again so it's comfortable for me. And I can see here is where my 3 inches, but I need to make sure that that is off. So if I work here, I'm going to damage that. So I have to work at about here. So walk the hammer to the edge, 60-40, clean that up here. Check it. Now perpendicular to this side. There it is. walk the hammer. So I start in the middle, walk the hammer over, 60-40, rotate it. And again, let the anvil do the cleanup. And I've got my oval now. My transition, my oval. So now it's just going to be a matter of, so I've got my reference plane, my oval cleaned up, and then transition. Now it's going to be a matter of cleaning up the middle. And I took 3 inches, and we'll see how much it stretches from 3 inches. So I have a feeling it's going to stretch about 1/4 inch. When I'm working in the fire, I rotate it in the fire, because a lot of the heat's going to come from the bottom, because that's where your blast is coming. So make sure you rotate it in the fire to get an even heat. Also, it just helps to see, making sure that you got your heat, and you also have the heat in the right spot. So this heat, I'm going to clean up my oval, and then I'll begin my shoulders for the adjacent forged square. So notice that transition is off the anvil. This transition is at the edge of the anvil. Okay, so now I've got my oval. It's clean. Now I'm going to begin this transition. So I'm going to rock it on the pooch. Rock the hammer to the edge. Rock it on the pooch. Rock the hammer to the edge. Okay, so that's the beginning of the tumbled oval into the forged square that's isolated in between the round. And I'm being too tricky, but I'm doing it on the diamond in relationship to that. So it's keep in mind these shapes, these fundamental shapes, but also the fundamental orientations of these shapes, how they relate to the bar itself. And that gives the work some sophistication, because you've got not only sometimes a change of cross-section, but also a change of plane. And if you look at Fritz Kuhn's work, a very famous blacksmith from Germany from the 30s through the 60s, that was one of the most profound elements that he used, was a very simple change of plane, sometimes only rotating 45 degrees. So his bar would be rotated 45 degrees. He would forge an element, a decorative element in the middle, and then you'd see the work, the bar on the diamond, and then the element that comes out of the diamond. And that's the kind of thing, those are subtleties that the eye is attracted to, and it gives you more than what be considered maybe a one-liner. It's like if you take stock and you hammer it and it's all predictable, it's a square on this square. And so these things add sophistication, and I want you to be aware of them. So in one bar, you know, in about 20 inches of material, I have so much to say. Here we go again. So I'm keeping this transition off, locking it from the middle to the edge, locking it to the middle, to that edge. Remember, 60-40, perpendicular. Is the cameraman's ears bleeding yet? So you can see where I'm going with this. Round, square, round on the diamond. I'll do one more heat to clean it up just a little bit. Another chunk of coke. What's the call over here? Pack it, feed your fire. Now this doesn't have to be super hot because all I'm going to do is clean it up. Operate your clinker breaker every once in a while. I mentioned earlier that this forge, or the coal that I have, is not particularly a high quality coal because I get a lot of clinker, and so just make sure that. So I'm just going to clean this forging up. Crisp up the edges a little bit. Okay, so I'm satisfied with that. That's my square broken by the 2 rounds. Now, to make this interesting, I'm going to twist this bar. I think I'll wait until later to, yeah, no, I'll twist it now. So, I started off with 3 inches. After that was forged square, I got 3 1/4. 3 1/4. So I want 1 1/2 twists on that 3 1/4. And the twist, round stock, you'd have to use a pair of vice grips. So, or use a vise with the round stock on the bottom, and I'll use a crescent wrench on the facet in one of the transitional shapes. Now, I make tools that twist, and these tools that twist, we'll cover this in the power hammer section. And again, I'm going to be like starting the power hammer next week. But this is a twisting wrench that I make, and I make it so that I've got 1/2 inch, 3/8, and 5/8, and also use these both as twisting wrenches for flat bar or 3/8, but also for bending forks in the vise. So I'll put that in the vise, and I've got a really delicate bending fork. Sometimes in an anvil, depending on the size of the party, you can drop this in an anvil. This anvil is a little bit big. This will work. So this is now a bending fork, and it's just so nice sometimes to have that much control. We'll talk later about bending forks. So what I want to do is I want to isolate the twist. I'm going to have 1 1/2 twists in a 3 1/4 inch length. And so I need to count the flats as I twist it around. Now, I'm going to use the Arkansas sprinkler, and I'll use this vise to twist it. So I'm going to preset my vise. So just anticipate that this is going to happen. I'm going to take the bandsaw out. I don't need this right now. That's a handy little tool. So I'm going to control the amount of heat that I have. I need a soaking heat, but I'm going to control the heat that I have with my, where'd my can go?
Here.
Oh. So this is right here. I'll tell you, I'm going to roll it this way. I'm going to bump the heat a little bit, but I just quenched that transition, but I want a full heat in that. So now I'm going to isolate it from the bottom with the vise, and I'm going to isolate it from the top with Okay, so I can use my twisting wrench here. Let's see, there we go. Yep. Use it here. So we got, let's start from scratch. There's quarter, half, 3/4, 1. And I'm going to stop at 1 1/4 because I need to find out what it's going to take in order to make that twist more even. So I've got 1/4 left, and I'm going to look at it, and it's not bad, but I want to find out where I need the heat. And so it looks like I need the heat right in here. Actually, that's where I quenched initially. So this is nice and even. The flutes are nice and even. It starts and stops here, but I need a little bit more heat here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat this area, drop this in the vise, and then twist it from here. And I'll need a pair of vice grips for that. Now what I'm trying to do is do this without using a torch. And normally I'd use a torch, but sometimes it's just nice to be able to control the heat. Just work with the 4 elements that man had at his disposal from the beginning of time. You got the fire, we have the earth, we got the wind, and we got the water. Okay, so these are the 4 elements that early blacksmiths had to work with. They didn't have vice grips though. So it's really important to be able to control your heat. Now I want the twist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quench this a little bit more here. And I'm bleeding a little bit of that heat. Let's see if I can. So I need 1/4 of a twist. There's my 1/4. Okay, now drop your twist in horizontal in your vise so that you can straighten up your twist. Also use the vise itself as a clamp. So I'm clamping it here and I'm clamping it here. While it's clamped there, pull this over a little bit, straighten that out. You may have to tap this side. Sight it. So I'm sighting it and it looks like I need to bend this a little bit more. Now that won't do much damage on each individual flute, but if I hit the flutes with the hammer, then we're talking about getting a lot of damage. So I've got 1 1/2 twists on 3 1/4, and it's pretty even. If I had a torch, and I do, but I don't want to work without a torch, and I'm looking for my wire brush. I don't know, I got it somewhere. Can you find it? Oh, thank you. Okay, so that's start and stop on the same plane, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 flutes. That means that I have 1 1/2 twists, because every time you twist 1/4 of a turn, you're going to get a flute. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So make sure that your flutes are on the same plane, and you'll do that by counting as you go around and also terminating in this plane. If you're not sure where you're at to line up your flutes, you can get 2 bars and you can balance the 2 bars. That'll work. You can balance a bar here. Easier said than done. And I can balance a bar here. So it's easier with smaller bars, honestly. If I balance a bar here, in theory, and I balance a bar here, you can sight it from this direction to see if you have any wind wind is where something has got twist to it. So if these bars aren't parallel, when you balance one here and balance one there, then you can either twist it or untwist it. But that's good for now. And it's relatively even. It just pops out. If you twist round stock, you're not going to get any flutes. You have to square it up. And this starts and stops with your with your transition. It's a little loose here and a little tight there, but I'm gonna have to go with that. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to talk about what we're going to do next. And I'll put this in the fire just to soak. And what I want to do is I want to talk about how to make that shepherd's crook. So the shepherd's crook is it's a beautiful shape. And looking around for, oh, there we go. A lot of stuff in smithing. It's a beautiful shape, and what I'm looking for is that this not just bends, but it shifts. So this goes from this direction to this direction and then back around. This also is centered along this bar. So if I do an imaginary center line, then the center of that would be right in the center here. Now this is forged to about 3/8. That's forged to about 1/8. And ideally, I'd like to have a 1-inch diameter. This is, I think this stock is 7/8. 1-inch diameter on the inside of this, and about 1/2 inch of space here. So if you forge this, you could, by trial and error, you could come up with that, but you can also calculate it. So let's walk over to the board. And in my classrooms, people ask me, is there a lot of math in blacksmithing? And my response is, every day, okay? So it's practical math, and so it's easy to understand when you're doing it on a daily basis. So oftentimes we have to calculate the stock before we start to forge. You don't want to cut when it's too long, or you don't want to have to weld it when it's too short. It's the cleanest forgings are when you understand how much material is going to be required for the shape. So I have this shape, and I want 1-inch ID, and let's change this a little bit since I changed the. So this is 1/2 inch here, but that's 3/8 there. And it goes down to 1/8. So if I want a 1-inch inside diameter, that's different than my outside diameter, because my outside diameter here is 3/8 plus 3/16, so plus 1 inch. So we're looking at about 1.5 inches. That's about 1.5 inches. So when I calculate the amount of stock that's going to be required for this shape, I need to take in consideration not the outside, which is 1.5 inches, not the inside, which is 1 inch, but the inside, which is 1.25 inches. So that is our neutral axis. So whenever you make a ring, any ring that you make, what you have to do is you have to measure it based on the neutral axis. The neutral axis is going to give you the length that you need before you bend it around. So if this was 6 inches, and if it was made out of 1-inch square bar, then my neutral axis would be 7 inches. And then in order to find the circumference of a shape, you multiply the diameter, which is the neutral axis, times pi. So 7 times pi, or 3.14, and you're going to get about 22 inches of stock. So it's deceiving sometimes how much material you need lengthwise for a ring. So if I want this to be 1 inch, and I know that this is going to be 3/8 when it's forged up here, it's going to be about 1/8 inch when it comes down here. The mean, the average of that is 3/8 plus 1/8, that's 4. The mean is 1/4 inch. So mean, I'll write it real small. Okay, so that means that my diameter is a mean of 1/4 inch. So it's 1 1/4, not 1 1/2. Now, the neutral axis is in the middle of whatever circle you have. So the neutral axis of that 1 1/4 is this formula. So neutral axis is where the dimension is taken for length of stock, circumference for circles. Our average neutral axis is 1 1/4. Multiply that by 3.14 and you get 4 1/4. Now I want a 1/2 inch gap here. because we're going to use this. I'll show you later. We're going to use this. This tool also is easy to hang if you've got a gap there. So with a 1/2 inch gap, 1/8 of an inch, 3/8 here, 1/2 inch stock to begin with, I need 3 3/4 inches long. So 1 1/4 times 3 1/4 is 4 1/4 minus the gap. That's 3 3/4. Now, why am I being so fussy on this? Well, it's like, if you're not fussy on this, what happens when you've got gates and railings, and you've got architectural pieces of light fixtures, you've got chandeliers, you've got to understand how much material is going to be required, and also for bidding, how much material do you need to order, how much is it going to weigh, how much is it going to cost, your cost stock wise. So this is very important to be able to calculate the amount of material that's going to be required for any shape. So our average is the 4 1/4. The average neutral diameter is 1 1/4 times 3.14, which is our pi. That's 4 1/4 minus our 1/2 inch gap. So I need a taper that's 3 3/4. Now here's the fly in the ointment, is that we're using round stock. So I need the length of this using round stock. So if we come back up here, a ribbon taper, and a ribbon taper is a taper that simply goes down to a point, and this dimension and this dimension are the same, so it doesn't flare out like a fishtail. So if I were to actually cut that, I could take a rectangle and I could draw a diagonal through it, and so that taper is half of this dimension, because I can get 2 tapers out of that. So a ribbon taper requires 0.5x. Okay, that's on square stock, because you have, remember we talked about before, you have the corners, and the corners provide about 20 some odd % of your volume, of your area. So on a ribbon taper requires on round stock, because round stock has 80% of the taper of the area that you need for a taper. So you have to increase the amount. So instead of 1/2 x, I'm going to go 0.625x. Everybody with me? Any hands? Any questions? Okay, good. Everybody understands. So x on round stock is 5/8 times 3 3/4 or 2 3/4. Okay, 2.34 or 2 5/16. So I need 2 5/16 of material to make a 3 3/4 taper with a 1/2 inch gap that goes from 1/2 inch, basically 3/8 to 1/8 of an inch with a 1/2 inch gap. Okay, I know I'm talking in circles, but you'll see it now. So before I do anything, I'm going to calculate the amount of stock that I need. So now with my tape, I'm going to mark that on the anvil, and I'll choose the edge of the anvil that I think is good for this. And it's going to be that slightly broken edge. I don't want a big radius edge, because it's going to give me suck in. So what I'm going to forge a shoulder in order to create that transitional shape. And if I forge a shoulder here, then I'll have a gradual 90 degrees. But if I forge a shoulder here, I'm going to have a much more abrupt 90 degrees. So this is where you start selecting the edge of your anvil. I'm going to get my stock hot. Again, I try not to, you can see my tapes are pretty clean. I don't measure hot with them. I'll measure hot with the consumable tape, and on a 25 footer, you've got tapes 2 foot lengths that'll last you years, okay? So you can use soapstone for this. Keep an eye on the forge. I need 2 5/16. There's my 2 5/16. I'm measuring backwards. Measure forward. 2 5/16. Okay, to the edge of the anvil. And when you measure something, you can say, okay, I'm going to make a mental note that, so that really is 2 1/4. But really, it's not. It doesn't matter, because that's an arbitrary line. If I know it's 2 1/4 from this edge, then I know it's 2 5/16 to the outside edge. So whenever I make a mark, it doesn't have to be perfect. it is a point of reference, and I'm going to say, well, I need to use that mark in the middle of the mark, or you need to use that mark to the other side of the mark. So in this case, it's close enough that, so this is 2 5/16. It's on the far edge of the mark, okay? So now I want to forge this shoulder, and a shoulder is a half-faced hammer blow. So I'm going to work half-face just like this, or a half-face. So this is an inside shoulder, and that's an outside shoulder. So I'm going to work on the inside, and when I set the shoulder, I want to make sure that it has orientation to something that, so I'm going to orient it to this flat. So it's important to keep things in mind as far as what is the, so it's going to go on the far side of that. And when I set a shoulder, so it's on the sharper edge, not the radius edge, I'm going to drop my stock a little bit. So it's half-faced hammer blows. Now I'm going to slowly lift that up. Okay, so if I go at it at an angle like I did, then it won't jump around on me. I hit it at an angle, and then so once I set it, then I could feel that edge, and then I raised it up, okay? Now I've got my shoulder set. It's at 2 5/16. I need to draw that out to 3 3/4. So I'm gonna mark that on the anvil too. And again, my anvil is 4 inches wide, so that's pretty handy. So I need to draw that taper out to that long. So I started it here. I'm gonna gain about 1 inch and a 1.25 inches. Okay. So I start the shoulder at an angle just to drive that in, because it's easy to drive this in. It's a little bit harder to drive that in. And don't let it jump around. Particularly when that shoulder is not very deep, it's going to want to double shoulder on you, and that's not a very attractive transition. So don't let that shoulder jump around. Now I've got my heat, and I'm going to work inside out. So I'm going to be working on the shoulder area. Notice where my heat is. You know, I'll straighten it up a little bit. Find my shoulder again. Correct the spread. So you have 90 degrees built into your wrist. So I can work it back and forth, but I can't work it back and forth this way. So I'll either twirl it in my fingers or I'll rotate my wrist. Okay, so this is forging to finish. It's a ribbon taper, so I don't want it to spread too much. Keep your twist off the anvil. I'm hammer polishing. Break the edges. Breaking the edges brings up a burr, so I'm going to knock that burr down. Okay, so that's ready to go back in the fire. I've got a slight taper. It goes from about 5/16, 3/8 down to about 1/4 inch. Now I'm nowhere near where I need to be. There's a lot of metal locked up in that bulb. So the idea behind this forging to finish and forging inside out is that now this doesn't get heated again. Only the bulb gets heated. So I'll be real careful about heating that bulb. Pack my fire. Move my chunk out of the way. Always pack your fire, run a tight fire. Right. So remember, you can create a blast. See that blast come up? You create a blast, and that's going to be the hottest part of your fire. So I'm just heating that bulb. Again, if this gets really bright, get your mop And it's a lot easier to look at if you see the difference. It didn't cool the fire down at all. It just made it a lot easier on the eyes to look at. Okay, so I have my bulb. Now I'm visualizing a taper. So my hammer is going to be tilting a little bit to use the edge of the hammer. And I'm going to keep my shoulder off of the anvil. Using the edge of the hammer, move that stock. Then correct the spread. Edge of the hammer moves the stock. Keep that shoulder off of the anvil. It's going to go down to 1/8 of an inch. Got a little material locked up in here. I'm going to do one more planish on it and I'll be able to get my 3 3/4. So I'm going to forge the taper a little bit low heat, and I'm going to work towards the end because I need that down to 1/8 of an inch. I also don't want it to round up. We talked about before how hot steel is. You put force on it and it goes into the round to the point in time if it was molten steel, you poured it on the ground and form a puddle. So I'm going to pack this in because I don't want that to be round. I want that to be squared off. Again, tilt the hammer a little bit. Break the corners. Final planish. This is very similar to the taper on the Monkey Hands of Death. See, we got, I need 3 3/4. I got 3 9/16. Whew. Mylar. We get one more hammer polish out of it and I'll get my length. This happens to you too. You're like, oh, this is just gonna happen in this one heat. Oh, I'm gonna have to take another heat. Oh, it's gonna happen in the second heat. Oh, you're gonna have to take another heat. So this is like, there's no CGI involved here. There's no clever editing. This is something that's going to happen to you too. So I need really a 1/16 of an inch. And by merely planishing it, I got it. Always break your corners. To me, the broken corners makes it soft on the hands. It also gives it a facet of light reflection, and it gives the paint something to adhere to. If you got a sharp edge, that's where your paint, your finish is going to knock off first. Okay. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm not going to bend this. I'm going to shift this. So this needs to be moved over this way. And in order to do that, what I need to do is I need to control my heat. So my heat is in here, and it terminates right about here. Let me talk about that. I'm gonna heat 2 bars. Pack my fire a little bit more. Believe it or not, you pour wet coal on that fire, in about 30 seconds you got a much hotter fire. And it's because that is not cooling off the fire, it's insulating your fire. So I'm going to be real careful with this. I'll move this chunk out of the way so that I can get Paul a little closer. Put the chunk back on top. It's nice to have up there. Now you always feed from the side, and what was coked is now the fuel. What is coal is replacing the coke. So you're coking your coal. It's a cyclical process. So I've got my heat on my bar. I'm gonna have to bend it here because I don't want to damage my twist, or I'll have to bend it here. So everybody will have a horn on their anvil. If you don't have a horn, you can do it in the vise. So the important thing is on a shift is that you control your heat. So if I don't control my heat, then my bend is going to come back into my twist. So I'm going to set this here, and it's going to be a shifting hammer blow. So that's not quite there, but it's very close. So that metal changed direction. It went from this direction to that direction because of the way I hit it. I hit it with an angled hammer blow, almost shearing it. This was supported here. Now I work the horn the same way I work the square horn. You work it perpendicular. So this line I'm bending it off of, I was holding it perpendicular to that line, okay? Now I want to show you the difference between a shift and a bend. A bend is not controlling your heat. So if I want that metal to go from one direction to the next direction, what's going to happen is I'm going to bend it here, but it's also going to bend here. So if you need a bend, great. If you need a shift, control your heat and change the orientation of the hammer blow. The hammer blow is more of a shear, and it takes that metal and it takes it from one direction and pushes it to the next. So I'm going to get this 3/8 hot. I'm going to do the same thing. 3 3/4 away from the end, I'm going to bend it. And I want you to see the difference by not controlling my heat and what happens to the stock. Okay, so about 3 3/4 of an inch from the end, if I bend it here, this is where it's bending. Okay, and that's not where I want to bend the multi-tool. The multi-tool has to shift here, not have a bend. The metal should shift here, but stay straight here. So that's the problem with bending on something that you want to have a drastic cross-sectional change, or the line that changes from one direction to the next. And we work more and more on this idea of these unexpected nuances of if you've got these like design elements, these tricks up your sleeve, keeping your twist off of the anvil. Now I've got my shift. My steel went from this direction to that direction. And the next task that I have is going to be hammering that into that shoulder. Okay, so I'm almost there. When that is no longer hollow, then I'll have my completed shift. We spend so much time on this one bar, but if we don't get past these fundamentals, you can make butterflies, you can make Renaissance elements, but if you don't have those transitions, you don't have those solid geometric shapes that are, you don't have the right amount of material, it's thin some area because you had to stretch it longer. You didn't understand the formulas, how it applies to round and square. So this one bar, it's the cheapest way of learning about 50 different lessons, and that's why I spend so much time on making this. And I also use this tool, so it's a functional tool. I'm going to leave this at about 75 degrees as I forge this. When we get into forging square corners, you'll see that when you forge a square corner, you're going to be doing pretty much the same thing as far as like leaving that stock in. I have to slap this because, so by slapping it, I should have controlled my bend a little bit more. I've got a tool for this. In other words, I should have quenched it before I started. But there's the tool. So worst comes to worst and you have to like actually do some brutal shaping on a twist, just wanted to take that little bend out right there. Okay. Yeah, had I paid attention to where I've got a little bit of bend there, but the next operation is actually going to take that completely out anyway. So let me show you what's next. Now, Hoppy has a beautiful design vocabulary, and many things that he does have these just exquisite little elements that really make the transitions pop. So one of the things that he does on a bend like this, and that would be perfectly aesthetic appealing without doing any more pushing of this shape. So what he does, which I like a lot, and I have seen previous in German texts and Czechoslovakian work, but what he does next is takes that corner and he pushes it out even further. Keeping the twist off the anvil. And you can see what the hammer blows are doing. Now on a pein, that pein isn't perfectly round. And let me talk about what that pein is doing. I'll put it back in the fire. It's radiused here, and it doesn't go sharp. Then it gets a second radius right here. So I knock that edge of that radius off and that edge of the radius off. So when I'm using the pein like this, I'm getting about a 5/8 inch fully that goes in. When I'm using the pein like this, or if it's coming off at an angle, then it's using this part of your pein. So it's the transition between the flat and the curve is a smaller pein. So it's important to note that because I'm not hitting it like this. You see the difference. That's working at bulbous. That's pushing the metal out because it's hitting at the edge of that transition of the pein. Okay, so it gives you that texture, the characteristic texture, because you know you're accessing the proper part of your pein. Do it from both sides so that you get an even spread of the material. Keep your twist off the anvil. Too cold, that's why it's jumping around. But I'm getting my shape that I want. I'm moving this metal out so that it restores that where had that slight bend to it. I'll do one more heat on that. I'll get it hot. As the heat diminishes, the steel becomes steel again. I worked for a blacksmith 35 years ago, and I said, what happens to steel when you get it hot? He says, it changes into something else. That wasn't a satisfying answer. What it does is it changes from your body center to your face centered crystal structure. It goes above transformation temperature. You have less attraction between the atoms on the crystals, so the crystals will move. They'll have one neighbor here, they'll shift to this neighbor, or they'll shift to this neighbor in the twinning process because you've got a space between those crystals. So that was a lot of answer that I was looking for, and he didn't quite have the patience to tell me that, or maybe he didn't know. But what we're doing is, yes, we're changing it into something else. It's still steel, but it's a face-centered cubic structure instead of a body-centered cubic structure. So when it's hot, it's gummy. So if it keeps bouncing off of you, you probably need to get it hot again. So I'm pulling that shape out and I'm going to center it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to support it here and clean up this part of it, and then clean up this part of it so that it matches that angle. So this is the shape that we got from shifting, then fullering that out and then cleaning up that shape as it relates to this bar and then that bar. Now it looks like a square corner. Okay, the last thing we'll do today is I'm gonna bend this around. And I could bend it around a fork. We talked a little bit about that already. I could bend it around a fork, but I could also bend it. I'll bend it, not so much shift it, but I'll bend it, and I'm going to find 1 inch. That's what I want in the middle. I want 1 inch. So 1 inch is going to happen. Remember, it's perpendicular. So horns are convenient. If you don't have a horn, remember you can grind a horn, or if you have to, you can buy these cast iron horns and you can work it vertically. So I could just as easily work it like this, but it's a little bit more efficient to work it when it's got the body of the anvil that's going to be supporting it. So I'm going to heat the area right past that beak, and I'm working perpendicular to the anvil, and I'm gonna start on the inside of the bend, and I'm gonna work towards the end. Okay, so that I don't want to work at the end because then it'll hide the area that I need to work on the inside. So I'm going to be working right next to that shifted, fullered end of the bar, and I'll finish bending the taper at the very last. So I've got my heats where I need it. I'm going to place this here, and I'm going to pick it back up, the black end. Take another heat. I'm gonna grab something that's 1 inch round. I could use as a mandrel. Now, I started up here, and then what you can do is you can continue the bend here. Now, I need to open it up, so I can drive it this way on the broken edge to open that up. I'm going to shift it over a little bit more to center it. So I'm visually making the ID round. This, the outside diameter, the inside diameter is going to be round, the outside diameter is going to be that tapered round. I need to slap it because it's off center. So this is kicked over this way. And if I take a block of wood and I slap it, then it'll center it, because the weight of the steel is still warm and it wants to, it's like hitting it with a hammer blow. The weight of it is just going to cause it to bend. So that way you don't have to disturb the shape. When you're centering, you can just slap it like that. Centering this part as it goes relates to the ribbon end. That's centered. So everything needs to be centered. And that's pretty close. A little bit more. And I'll wire brush it and I'll see if it works. Slap it a little bit more. If I didn't have that twist there, I could slap it on the anvil. So I have that twist there, then I have to slap it using the block because I don't want to damage my twist. Now I've got a little bend here. This is kind of advantageous. I've got a little hollow in this piece of hickory. Take that out. That looks good. Wire brush, always something falling on the floor. There it is. Wire brush it. Never quench it. I see this a lot. People quench at this temperature. If you quench at this temperature, it's going to be brittle. I'm going to let it air cool down to about 500 degrees. Then I'll quench it. What's 500 degrees? If it still smolders wood, it's 500 degrees. So the very edge is 500 degrees. That's 450 or so. 451 degrees Fahrenheit is the practical temperature that wood burns. So I'm at about 500 degrees. So I can quench this. Now sometimes I don't take it down all the way. If I don't want to harden that, I'll take it down in bursts. I'll burst. And then when it stops boiling and it's just evaporating, then I can take it down the rest of the way. Okay. Now, I like wire brushing hot, and that's what I did is I wire brushed hot. But you can finish your wire brushing cold. Now this is almost done. The last thing I want to do on this and if anything, make sure that your work is straight and the planes are lined up. You know, you've got workman-like quality to all of the shaping that you're doing. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little screwdriver end on this side. So what I'm going to do is to make a screwdriver, and let's look at what a screwdriver looks like. And I'll put that in the fire and I'll pump the heat up a little bit. But a screwdriver widens and then it tapers. And then this is just the taper. Now, when you make a screwdriver, it's kind of important that that blade terminates like this, not at a true ribbon angle, but we're not going to concern ourselves with that right now. But if it's tapered like this, the end of your screwdriver, then when you use it for your screws, your screwdriver will cam out. So you'll be loosening or tightening, and it'll just like push itself out because of that taper. So a screwdriver really should be ground so that the last depth of what's going into the screw is parallel. But nevertheless, if I want this shape on the end of my bar, so this is forged on the diamond, and you can see this is an old craftsman, and they did forge this. You can see it's like they broke the edge and that into the almond, and then it spread, but then it tapered back this way. So it's beautiful sometimes when you even see like industrial shapes, how they paid attention to, or they use the collapse of that square into the diamond to get that wide stock in probably one heat. But I don't want to fight what happens here, because if I don't prefigure my steel before I forge it into this blade shape, then it's going to be twice as wide as this. It's going to be about a 1/2 inch. This is about 1/4. This is about 3/16. So what I'm going to do is on this anticipated edge, I'm going to knock it down at a little bit of an angle. So it would be this plane right here. I'm going to hold it up about 15 degrees and hit it about 30 degrees. And even it out on both sides. So I took it down about half the dimension from about 3/8 to 3/16. Now I'm going to forge my blade. So when you prefigure, what you do is you think about the shape, what's going to happen to the steel, and steel is going to want to go round. So what I did is I necked it down perpendicular to where it's going, or perpendicular to the actual shape, so that it's thinner in this plane, so then it'll restore it. But prefiguring is one of those things in smithing that takes you to the next level. It's these subliminal things, these not so obvious things that the blacksmith is taking into consideration. Say for instance, working perpendicular to a horn. I never saw that, because you'd go to a blacksmith demonstration and you'd beat it till it looks right. You'd get a corkscrew on your curves and you wonder, why can't I get that to bend? Why can't I get it to shift? Why do I have double shoulders? Why do I have I-beam effect? All of these things. But when you take it to the next level as far as anticipation of what the material is going to do, then you have more of a mastery of the material. And so it's the next level of blacksmithing, and that next level includes this idea is prefiguring. So I prefigured this stock so that now I'm going to lift it at about the same angle, about 15 and 30 degrees. And when I hammer this back, you can see it gives me more of a screwdriver shape. If I didn't prefigure, then I would be fighting the amount of the metal that would be stretching. So I'm going to take another heat and finish this screwdriver shape. If it's a screwdriver, if you don't have one, it's a pry bar. It's a lever. It's what else I use? I've used these. I've used them as pokers. I've used them as pointers, spacers. So it's a tapered blade on a stick. Use your imagination. So keeping my transitional shapes off the anvil. Now tilt it up just a little bit. And there's your screwdriver shape. Hammer polish. This is also packing, where you're really getting quite a bit of strength in the material, working it right at that transformation temperature. And see if you can't forge to finish at the anvil. So I want that blade, I don't have to grind it if I forge to finish it by controlling how that metal spreads. Okay. So there's my screwdriver shape. And it's nice sometimes to look how that hexagon, this 16 sides, there's the 8 sides, how the 8 side gets collapsed. And you can see the facet of that hexagon as it spreads into the widest part of that screwdriver, into the narrow part of the screwdriver. So usually at this time of the day, whether it's in the morning or night, I'm gonna use this tool to see if I can open up a nice bottle of wine. Only most expensive wine do I choose. It's Sangria Señorial. And so this tool works. First you shake it up a little bit, and then it levers off. Sangria Señoral. I don't have a contract with them yet. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you learned something in this episode. Next week, I want to talk about the fundamentals of power hammer forging. Thank you. Ugh.